Welcome to the second session of our ImpactAbility learning series with our hosts Al Admansky and Vicki Kamak. Today's session is entitled, Create a Container for Your Content. My name is Ted Kuntz. I am Chair of the Plan Institute, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. The mission of Plan Institute is research, education, and social innovation. We look for opportunities for dialogue, collaboration, and partnership. We are pleased to work with Tamarack Institute as one of our partners in this series. Tamarack is one of the leading organizations in collective community impact. This webinar series focuses on the incredible impactability of individuals in the disability movement. Al and Vicki have recognized that people with disabilities and their families have a distinct talent for continuously inventing and creating their way out of adversity. I've had the good fortune to work with Al and Vicki over the years during their founding of Plan and Plan Institute. Al and Vicki have a talent for recognizing new ideas and innovations and bringing those new ideas to scale. In today's discussion, Al and Vicki and their guests Jack Pierpoint and Linda Kahn will discuss the importance of creating the right container when sharing your idea or innovation. In order to have impact, we need to do more than come up with the right analysis or the right solution. Rather, we need to create a container that can engage others and inspire people to action. I'd now like to welcome the hosts of ImpactAbility, Al Admansky and Vicki Kamak. And I'll turn it over to you, Al and Vicki, to introduce your special guests.
Thanks, Ted. And welcome everyone to our conversation with Linda Kahn and Jack Pierpoint. You know, a common challenge activists and change makers have is converting our message into tangible actions. We often get caught in a cloud of concepts, requests, emotions, ideas, values, outrage, research, vision, impulses, and ideology all swirling around us in our change-making journey. The listener or recipient of our message is bound to be confused, reacting perhaps to our emotion, wondering how to sort through the many signals we're sending. They might be a little leery of wading in too much detail or fatigued by another list of must-dos. They may actually want to do something, but they're unclear how. Al and I have experienced all of these things over the course of our work. And we have discovered that no matter how important your message, you must make it easy for people to do the right thing. And what this means is converting your content into a literal or figurative container. The container can be something like a campaign, an organization, a slogan, an app, a platform, a book, a box. Even a bear or a red nose. You're going to have to check out Al's latest book for those examples. But this point about converting content into a literal or figurative container holds true whether you are recruiting new members, seeking funding, or expecting government to implement your suggestions. Today, Al and I are thrilled to have two people who excel at this conversion from content to container, Jack Pierpoint and Linda Kahn. One of the main reasons they are talented and advocates, presenters, and movement builders is because of their outstanding ability to create literal and figurative containers for their big, bold, and beautiful ideas. Welcome, Linda and Jack.
Thank you.
That's a little embarrassing, but yes, thank you.
As somebody once said, I'd like to meet those people.
Exactly.
But seriously, it is sincerely offered, and it's a joy for us to snag you for an hour. Are you somewhere close to home, or are you in one of your more exotic locations that you're bound to travel to?
Today we are at home, which is really nice. Trying to figure out what that smells like and tastes like.
Yeah, well, we've been to your home, so we know how exquisitely beautiful it is, surrounded by, are you still taking photographs of every place you went to?
Oh yeah, of course. It's easier now with digital.
So, Linda and Jack, as Vicki has described, it's not good enough to be right. Darn. You have to be able to cut through the swirl of emotions and analysis and the solutions. And so my first question to both of you is, how do you frame an issue creatively? How do you work to generate aha moments that change the way people see things?
Well, I think you have to begin on your inside, because if you don't know where you're at, it's going to be a pretty bizarre journey. And for me, that's about a deep commitment to social justice, which, you know, came from very early and has been through many iterations over time. And then I think for me, it's you look around and see what gets your attention. And for me, after 7 years more or less in West Africa and working in war zones and all that kind of thing, where I witnessed too much pain and simultaneously amazing capacity to reinvent the future. When I came back to Canada, I became the president of Frontier College. And the college had an amazing history, but it was in a state of collapse because historically it had reached out to people on the geographic margins in work camps, logging camps, railroads, and so on. You know about that, Al. And what had happened of late, technology had changed the world. And so that the people that used to be there weren't there anymore. And so we assumed that they'd gone somewhere. And when we began to look around for who had been missed by opportunity to have a full and adequate education, we discovered that a lot of people were in jail. A lot of people were on the street. People with disabilities had never been included at all. Indigenous peoples had either had a really bad experience with education through to grim. So we began to reframe who had been missed, and then we started listening to them, which sounds like a very simple thing, but we just talked to a lot of people about what would be helpful. And two themes emerged. One was literacy. Reading and writing and sort of access to that kind of information is really important. And jobs. And you put those two together and you end up, and we created a variety of programs that reached out to people on the street, in and out of prison, beat the street, all kinds of things, but it reached out. And one of those programs, it's embarrassing to think about it now, but we was literacy for the disabled. But you know, those are the words of that era. But we recruited all kinds of people who were labeled disabled both as students and as tutors. And we discovered that when you turn people into tutors and teachers, they blossomed. And so, you know, that got our attention and turned into all kinds of things. Parallel to that, Marcia Forrest was deeply committed to trying to figure out what do you do to get little kids included in schools, because it wasn't going very well. And we were trying to figure out how do you do that, because typically when people tried to include a little kid in a classroom, the teacher would be completely traumatized because they got a file of medical records that would, you know, choke almost anybody and scare you to death. And so we began to wonder, isn't there another way? And that turned into listening to people to tell their stories. and we invented a template. We invented a container to help people be able to tell their story in a way that revealed their incredible gifts and capacities. And then we turned out that that was a really good idea in schools and out of schools, and it was good for 5-year-olds and 105-year-olds, and so we began to play with that. We also discovered that if you drew it, if you used graphics, it transformed the impact. Simply telling people things was pretty ineffective. Listening to them had incredible power. Creating a visual record of those conversations was magical for people. People never got to see their stories. And when they could see their stories, they could begin to see and imagine futures and possibilities that were always there, but they didn't have the courage or the strength to say them out loud. And so those are the kinds of things that captured me and got us on a journey of inventing a variety of containers that helped people to think about better futures where their gifts were realized.
So thanks, Jack, and thanks for that reminder of my ancient past with Frontier College.
Yeah.
Linda, and we want to canvas everything that you've talked about here and dive a little deeper, because this the back that you so easily discuss is not as easy for many of us. But Linda, when I first heard about you, you were doing things as an administrator in an American state that everybody else wanted to do, but they couldn't. And so their intentions were great. Their desire was strong. They had a multitude of activities and programs they wanted to offer, but somehow it got stalled. Yet you were able to kind of cut through all of that. So just give us a little bit of that background for the listeners.
You know, I think that I never let go of kind of the roots of the source of my motivation and my outrage at social injustice. And I think sheer will and determination to stay really rooted in a frame that was about liberating people and respecting their voice and their place in anything we were ever trying to do was really motivating to me and really shaped a lot of what I did. And when I forgot, I was lucky enough to have people who shared those beliefs, knew I believed in, and would hit me upside the head and say, I know you believe this, and I feel like we've gotten off course, and what about the role and voices of people and families in this process? And there were other stakeholders involved, and you know, the folks who offered services who really wanted to make that same stretch, and we worked together from a solid values frame of really something that actually still pervades the work and all of the writing that Inclusion Press does and that Jack and I do together. And it was really rooted in the 5 valued experiences that John O'Brien and Connie Lyle O'Brien share and talk about. So really thinking about belonging and sharing places in community and choice making and valued roles and status and contribution. That frame actually guided and is, I think, by this conversation, absolutely a container. It guided decisions that happened in practice with people and their families and the approach of the supports and services when they were part of the equation, and they guided the policy we were doing. We used it to say, is this helpful? Is this going to get more of what's really worth working for? And I really worked with leadership that absolutely gave the room and succeeded someone in the state of Rhode Island, Bob Carl, who was really brilliant at setting the container and quite a rule breaker in his own right, and I didn't know any better. And we really worked on a philosophy that if you could imagine it, it must be possible.
Beautiful. It's great to hear from you both. I loved Jack's comment there about beginning on your inside, and certainly both of your commitments to social justice. And then also, Linda, your final comments there is so interesting about, in a way, the naivete at the beginning, certainly, of our change journeys and our, our belief, if we can see it, it is possible. Those are real sources of fuel or energy for our journeys. We wanted to just take a moment and really think about path, which is, that this is really your creation, and I think it is a tool that virtually all of our listeners are going to be familiar with. The path as a strategic planning process is quite simply a stunning container. It is, until there was a path, the whole planning process was really the purview of professionals. It was a dull and formal kind of process, and path, it made it fun, it made it inclusive, it made it desirable, it energized it. So we're really interested about, Jack, you talked a little bit about your discovery around some of the graphic facilitation and so on. We'd just love to know a little bit more about what led you to embrace this whole new way of making change, and be happy to hear as well, kind of some of your thinking as you began to see path being picked up, as you started it, you demonstrated it, you trained about it, and you began to see it spreading. How was that?
Well, as usual, there are no simple answers to a question like that, and perhaps an obvious place to begin is meeting Judith Snow, who pushed all our buttons to the extreme when she graduated from university and was graduated by the Ontario government to a nursing home, which was the only facility for a person with a master's degree. And Judith ultimately decided that since she was being killed there, quite literally, she wasn't going to die there, so she simply left. And that meant we ended up with an emergency as we brought her to our house and called everybody together to try and figure out what in the world do we do. And we called everybody we knew, we sat up all night, formed some committees, and by morning we had invented a number of strategic groups to try and figure out a life for Judith, and that was 1978. But Judith called that the Joshua Committee for Breaking Down Walls. But Judith began working with Marcia and I, with Marcia, and they began playing with this idea of maps and schools and all kinds of things. And we began discovering the power of the graphics. And so those two approaches emerged. And then as we listened to stories, particularly with maps, we realized that for many people, telling their story in a time of crisis was really painful. And so maybe there was an alternative way to get to the same place, which was, what do you do? What do you do in the morning? Because simply having a pretty picture on the wall is a complete waste of everybody's time. But that's how PATH got invented. And PATH was essentially it's a variation on the MAPS process, but we, borrowed ideas from Eric Trist and David Sibbett and Brian and Connie, and all that came together. It was a collaborative effort, and we began playing with this arrow idea of planning backwards to invent the future you want. And it was very much an invention that went through multiple iterations to see what worked really well, and it continues to do that. The original ideas we had have evolved from our experience and the experience of thousands and thousands of others, because you're right, it has a kind of impact on people that is quite extraordinary. That wasn't anything we were just trying to do the right thing and see what worked. It turns out that was a pretty good idea, and so it has traveled through many, many languages across many continents and countries. I think one of our biggest delights relatively recently was we were back in New Zealand after many trips there, and we were toured around to visit with about 150 Maori path facilitators who are engaging their communities in conversation using paths from everything from family reconciliation, prison release, treaty negotiations, credit ratings with banks. You name it, they're doing it. And disability has absolutely nothing to do with it. That's just part of reality. It's not a disability tool, it's a human tool. I think the other feature of circles, maps, and path that's a common denominator is that it builds relationships. So many of the traditional processes that we've engaged in historically are top-down and bureaucratically, systemically based. And this goes to the other extreme and says the right people are around you. They're your family, your friends, and people you have relationships with. So it mobilizes that capacity by gathering people around to listen to stories and think about the future together. And that turns out to be incredibly powerful. It actually switches the rules pretty dramatically, because I think historically we've been, and tragically even today in many cases, we're doing things to people. And circles and maps and paths are based on relationships, and therefore we're doing things with people. And that makes all the difference.
One of the things that I've come to appreciate in the process of many conversations using path and maps, so we'll focus on path right now since you've asked about that one, is really appreciating it as actually a pattern of conversation. And it's really made up of 8 conversations, and in kind of looking at the sequence, as Jack described it, with really starting with thinking about what matters most deeply to someone and their highest purpose. And what I really appreciate is that through the conversations and recording this graphically, with everyone able to see it, is the sense-making aspect, and being able to see actually even overall with people in a collective conversation what emerges and what the patterns are in what even happens in the various 8 conversations of a path. And when I think about the conversation guidelines that we set at the beginning of the process, I mean, one of the things that always strikes me is a quote from Carl Week, who says, "How can I know what I think until I see what I say?" And I think that's one of the things that's really manifest in both path and maps and these kinds of and planning approaches and containers that enable people to be able to consider what they think and then begin to notice the patterns that come around what matters most deeply for them, and then taking action. So the visual aspect is really important and often works in imagery and even metaphor, which is very powerful for considering where you are, your intention, and where you want to go.
Okay, I can see Twitter land lighting up with that last quote, and Jack, previously the suggestion that Hath is really planning backwards, and that strikes me as the kind of creativity that we all yearn for, is to take something that's so obvious and then flip it on its head. You also talk about, in many ways, adversity being a breeding ground for creativity, and in effect diving into the adversity rather than kind of blocking it or doing something in parallel. And I think that's a good lesson for all of us. And I want to talk about that for a moment, because I think it links to a question, or rather a comment, that Linda made earlier around values. And I know that path, for example, because we've talked to business leaders about it, that if you had wanted to, you could have packaged it or repackaged it as a business book and probably made a lot of money, but you've chosen not to. And I think this kind of conversion of our content into a container that helps people do the right thing can veer, if we're not careful, very quickly into quicksand. People use these tools of framing and packaging to convince us to buy stuff, or to vote for them, often with complete disregard for values, or what it may do to the environment, or how we take care of each other, or to the well-being of people with disabilities. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to use a different framing for this than marketing or public relations or branding. Over to the two of you, but just a comment or so on what prevents this kind of creativity from sliding into propaganda.
Vicki, right at the beginning, you said some things get your dander up. This is certainly one of my hot spots, because from the very, very beginning, Marcia and I and John sat as we were inventing these things and said, okay, because we were being, it was recommended to us by many people that we should, really bolt it down and control it so that we could stop people from doing bad things with it. And we thought about that, and my framing was that, just because somebody's had 17 years of medical education doesn't mean they're going to be a great doctor. It means they've had 17 years of medical education. Being a great doctor is beyond that. And so we decided not to tie it down, but rather to give it to the world. And we figured our task was to keep raising the bar and reminding people about how important this was. Along that journey, perhaps the most frustrating thing for us is that systems, governments, all kinds of people all over the world see this as a really good thing. That's good. And then they want to mandate it and reduce it to something they can implement every year on your birthday, or whatever silly rule gets developed, and then reduce it to something that becomes a modified ticky box that you can knock off in half an hour with or without the person present, and all kinds of absolute lunacy. And so we're doing everything we can to object to that. We have refused to certify, because we think the way you become masterful at this is based on Musashi, a samurai warrior, where you become masterful by investing your lifetime in doing this, because it's a way of living. It's not something you pick up overnight. And we want this to be a way to liberate people, not to control them. And so the journey continues.
So resistance to requirement of the processes is, I think, at the heart of some of this, and being willing to engage in conversation about that. And actually the insight of not really thinking about these, frankly, as tools, but as you suggest, they are containers, they are patterns of conversation, and facilitation is an art. And so we think that it makes it really difficult, as Jack said, to kind of step into certification or requirement. And so we're resistant to that.
One historical example, but in the early 80s, Marsh in particular was organizing events for families because they were, quite frankly, desperate for ways to think about the future that were more freeing. And that was happening, and under pressure it turned into the McGill Summer Institute and later the Toronto Summer Institute, which has been going since '84. But part of our illusion was in 1984, when we had the first McGill Summer Institute, our agenda, we had a very clear agenda because we thought this was really important stuff. We thought we were going to recruit, in particular, school directors and superintendents and a few principals, and we were going to explain to them with great logic the importance of full inclusion and these kinds of processes which we were inventing. And we thought we'd run that a couple of times. The impact of that ingenious idea would be so powerful that everything would be fixed and it'd be over in the morning. And I want to report that we were an abject failure, that we did recruit one superintendent and one director over about 30-odd years. But those people were important, but we had to make adjustments in order to figure out how do we communicate with people. And the Summer Institute is still operative each summer. And it is a place where people come to think together, to learn together, to be re-energized. You can learn a little bit about maps and path, but much more important, discover that this is bigger than disability. This last summer we began focusing on the link between the realities of Indigenous people's exposure to Western education, particularly through residential schools, and the parallel reality of the institutions that many folks with disabilities have been incarcerated in, and how those parallel realities are still alive and well in terms of the impacts on families and some of the difficulties we have to work through in order to take advantage of and recreate the incredible capacity of people who have been set aside and all too often abused by our systemic policy.
Thanks to both of you. There's so much wisdom contained in both your answers, and thinking about your talking about how PATH has spread, and there is a depth of knowledge in that learning that you have shared. I remember Al and I going and talking with you and Marsha, looking for advice as we began thinking about sharing our learning at Plan, and it's very, very important wisdom. This idea of an art is really at the heart of much of what it is that you're talking about, and is contained in something like a path. Where I want to go now, and this is a question from one of our listeners as well, and you have just referenced it too, Jack. It's about, this journey is a long one, the change-making journey. There are no quick fixes. And so, we find ourselves decades on continuing to do the work, often some of the same activities. In your case, many years of the summer institutes, PATH and MAPS training and so on. So we're really curious about, how do you sustain yourselves? What is your kind of, what's your creative process, and how do you keep it fresh after all these years?
For me, personally, well, how do you stay fresh? It's got to be personal. It's not going to work at all. But for me, diving into the lives of real people, by real people I mean people who happen to have encountered disability in some of their lives and stories, Indigenous people who are in this decade having the courage to begin exploring and telling the truth about residential schools and their impact on communities. Those things, for me, cause outrage and re-energization. So that sounds sort of strange, but we need to have a mega cultural shift. And the leadership from that is going to come from the margins. It's going to be, for me, I think, it's going to be a newly invented alliance, collaboration, partnership between people who've been labeled with a whole variety of disability labels and people who have been deprived of full access to education and have been incarcerated in residential schools for periods with all the follow-on that's there. But that experience of incredible difficulty energizes people because they know there has to be another way, and they have the energy to work toward it. And so when I see that and feel it and taste it, I am renewed. So I think that's where a lot of my energy comes from. And because those folks see the world differently, I can see new possibilities.
It's interesting. So much of that is the same for me as well. I think being willing to be in inconvenient conversations with hard questions that you really don't know the answer to, and with a diversity of people makes a really big difference for me. And staying outraged actually also creates energy, because I find there's a real pattern to being energized by people's stories and the work that they're doing, and finding common ground across really many different groups of people who've been pushed to the margins, as folks with disabilities have been, and just kind of coming home to remembering what's really at the heart and soul of the work. All of those people, all of those pieces, and staying connected to other people on the journey, and conversations with folks like yourselves. I mean, I think about what you do to stay energized, and would in turn ask you that question. I mean, just how do you keep going?
It's the rain. It's the rain, Linda. We don't, and you know what? I'd love to dive into that question, but you know what? We are running out of time, and we're getting lots of questions that are coming in. So I definitely want to remind our listeners that we're talking to Linda Kahn and Jack Pierpoint, changemakers extraordinaire, and keep your questions coming. If we don't get to them all on the web webinar, we'll forward them to Jack and Linda, and perhaps we can persuade them to answer them directly. And Jack and Linda, if you don't mind, we're going to probably have to do more of a pepper set of questions for the next 10 minutes or so.
Sure.
We can't go any further without talking about the birth of the concept of inclusion. So we talk about all of the other things that you do, but then to influence a culture in a way that a concept, a word, can spread around the world. I mean, like, that's holy grail for a lot of us. And, you know, inclusion, you know, on one level is an attempt to codify a vision that's bolder than integration, and certainly bolder than mainstreaming, which was the kind of thing that we all talked about way back. The concept is simply majestic. It's redefined how we think about education, and indeed living in the community, indeed how we treat each other, not only in the disability world, but also beyond. So, you know, this is the short version, but tell us about the birth of inclusion. I think it was in your living room and its journey to become a global cultural norm.
It was actually in the boardroom at Frontier College in August of 1988. But it was, Marcia and I called together a meeting of, I don't know, I think 17 or 18 people from around the continent who were agonizing over the fact that our efforts to have an impact in education and beyond in the world of disability were really being frustrated. And part of that was precisely that mainstreaming and integrated education and the terminology of the time had become so watered down it was meaningless. It meant absolutely, somebody would tell us a story about how wonderful their mainstreaming program was, and you'd go and look and you'd just be traumatized. And so our words had been stolen. The meaning had been just milked out of them. So we had a meeting, and there were many levels of frustration. But what happened was we said, well, maybe we need to invent a new word. And somewhere in that meeting, someone said inclusion, and it wasn't. We're not even sure. Anyway, the word was tried out, and everybody around the table said, yeah, that's a good word, and it's going to be ours. So starting today, let's all just use it. And it exploded because it captured what we were talking about, and because it was new and untried for many years, we were able to shape the conversations. Unfortunately, as all of us know too well these days, inclusion is the victim of the same kind of pressures, that it's not as crisp as we want. And I think what I would like to do is to reclaim the real meaning of the word and take out a lot of the watered down versions. Maybe we'll have to reinvent another term, but it is an elegant term. And controlling the language is a very powerful idea.
Wow, the birth of a revolution in the creation of a word. It's pretty interesting reflection on, I think, the power of the language that we're using. I want to jump to another really good question from one of our listeners. And Linda, this one is for you. And the question is, specifically related to, you talked about your rage, and so the question is, how do you ensure your enraged energy actually energizes you instead of making you feel helpless? Today, I mean, so much of our discussion is about making the world a better place. It's wrapped up in language of politics and economics and advocacy. It's doomy, it's gloomy, and we obsess about lots of this stuff, and sometimes even our fear is perpetuated. So you know, I know in so much of your work, I mean, you talked about your rage, it's a source of energy, but I also know that a lot of your work is joyful, playful, beautiful. So how do you keep tapping into that vein of energy?
It's a funny thing. I have a good friend who helped me once think about what works and doesn't work for me, which is actually one of the maps or windows into thinking about personal futures planning. And one of the things that actually works for me is no. It makes me think it's the beginning of the conversation. There is a kind of possibility view that I stay with, that makes me think even when it looks not possible, there really must be a way. So the outrage just creates an energy for me for action and a determination to do that, and finding people who I can stay in that kind of conversation with, who will, because it just sucks the life out of you to stay in despair. I can go to that place only briefly, and then there just has to be a way to move forward, and allies, and finding allies who will think with you about that even when there is no clear answer, who'll stay in the conversation with you.
A quote we always attribute to Inclusion Press, which incidentally is another one of your many containers. You just set out and became a successful book publisher. But the quote that shows up on that website, on your website, is, and you probably know it, that change is constant, growth is optional. And this question is really about your growth. You mentioned earlier David Sibbett, and you know the kind of godfather, I think it's fair to say, of graphic facilitation. You were on to him 30 plus years ago, Jack. You mentioned Eric Trist, and I know you attend workshops led by Otto Scharmer and pay a lot of attention to the concept of presencing and theory U. Now, our listeners may not be familiar with those folks, but I think what you do is go and learn and explore, and then bring them back into our world, into the disability world. So, could you talk a little bit about theory U, about Scharmer, and what you found as value for your work, for you personally, but also for the hard work that you're about on a daily basis.
Yeah, Scharmer's one of many people. And this has a huge lean on the incredible wisdom of John O'Brien and Connie Lyle O'Brien, because there are wizards on many, many fronts. But John does things like, and in this past weekend, I was in Darien, Connecticut for to honor Bob Persky's passing, and that was a reminder that there are many people on this journey that we have been learning from. So, you know, we were remembering Mark Gold and Wolf Wolfensberger and Bob Persky and some of those contributions along this journey, but they very quickly, you know, and you have to stay current with whoever's current. And Scharmer has an amazing insight, which I think ultra simply, the journey from A to B is often perceived as a straight line, which was a wonderful idea, but it actually doesn't happen that often in reality. And alternatively, if we slow down and listen and listen and listen and let go, we're able to begin to see things differently, and ultimately to invent alternative futures. And for me, one of the things that, Charmer is extraordinarily popular in the business world and on the global front. But I think if you want a coach for Charmer's work, if you get someone who thinks a little more slowly and therefore has to be a little clearer and doesn't have any of the filters, you may well have your master tutor right in front of you and beside you, someone who can slow you down and doesn't understand any of your sophisticated terminology. Therefore, you have to really slow down and just bloody listen. And then when you do that, new possibilities begin to emerge. And that's the U theory. But we've got to slow down and listen and let it go. Almost the precise opposite of what systemic and systemic demands are. Please do it faster with less and deliver more. And Charmer's theory is the exact opposite.
Beautiful. I had never actually thought about our family members and many of the people that we're privileged to support as master tutors in this realm specific to theory U. So that's phenomenal, Jack. Just for our listeners, by the way, we'll put up some links to Otto Charmer as well as for John and Connie Lyle O'Brien's work, so you know, because I know there's been a number of references to those things. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I wonder if we can hear from both of you just a quick couple of reflections on the future of the disability movement.
Oh, that's a quickie. Well,
just given how you feel about it.
I think what we've been doing for a long time is we have, all of us collectively, have become servants of the system. And if you look at where budgets go, that's pretty clearly what's been happening. And I think what we ought to be and want to be is liberators of people. And that's a much more exciting agenda. And I think that is entirely possible because I think our society is approaching a tipping point. But the tipping point is not going to be led by us. I think the new leadership is going to come from the margins, and my hope is that a new partnership between Aboriginal and Indigenous people who have been excluded and people who have been excluded by medicalized labels will invent entirely new possibilities and help all of us to listen more deeply in new and different ways and build relationships that are entirely different that will enable us to renew communities and relationships right across the board. I think it's possible. It's certainly necessary.
I think the future will have a contribution from systems, but the answers aren't inside systems. I think looking to listen closely and support people's movements is where I think the great energy and the insights and the strongest alliances will be in supporting people and bringing those gifts from the margin to the center and deeply listening to people and finding solutions together in that way.
Our friend Beth Mount just described this as we need to have the courage to journey into our blind spot. And her example was that with the Hubble telescope, we've just recently, after millennia of looking at the stars, discovered that there are 10,000 more galaxies than we ever thought. And I think that's the kind of future that's out there.
Now that's a rather majestic image to leave, to leave us with. We don't know anything about starry nights out here on the West Coast, although Jack and Linda will be sure to post the date of your next Summer Institute for the folks if you've decided on it. along with all of the other references that have come out of this conversation. But what a pleasure to talk to people, to a couple that that works together, lives together, and loves together. So thank you both very much, and we'll pass it back to our able host, Ted Kuntz.
Well, thanks, Alan, Vicki, and Jack and Linda. That was pretty rich conversation. I was particularly inspired by some of the thoughts about finding leadership in the margins and looking for those partnerships or allies, maybe in sectors that we haven't gone before. So it's got me thinking, because I have some challenges that I need to find some allies with. So thank you for that. So time to bring this webinar to a close. I want to thank all of our partners who support the Plan Institute and Tamarack in hosting this webinar series. They make it possible. I also want to thank everybody for joining us on this webinar. Your comments and your questions make this dynamic and thought-provoking. Remember to look for an email later this week that will have links to the audio and other materials that were talked about in today's webinar, as well as the discount code for Al's book. And we're always looking for your feedback, so please email us if you have something for us to consider. Our next webinar is on Monday, November the 14th, 9 Pacific time, 12 o'clock Eastern time. And the pattern under discussion will be Mobilize Your Economic Power. Al and Vicki will be interviewing Liz Mulholland, who's the CEO of Prosper Canada. A reminder that you need to register for each of these webinars individually, and so if you've not done so already, please register for your next webinar at the link on your screen, or go to events.tamarackcommunity.org/impact-ability-home. We also have exciting events and resources available through the Plan Institute, so go to that website, planinstitute.ca or rdsp.com, to learn more and sign up for our monthly e-zine. Thanks again, everyone, for a great conversation. Enjoy your day, and thank you for joining us.